For USCFootball.com, I'm Jack Smith, joined by Connor Morrissette for instant analysis from USC's Wednesday practice of Penn State week. We had a big day yesterday, tons of news. Going to front you guys now. We don't have a huge, big news day, but we're here to break down practice, talk a little bit about what we heard from defensive coordinator D'Anton Lynn and some defensive players after practice. And Connor, let's start. What were your practice observations?
Well, on Wednesdays, we get to see that first-team offensive line go against the scout team defense. And usually it's the backup center who's taking reps at center, but today it was Jonah Monheim, the starting center, and then the offensive line, pretty much as we expected, exactly the same as it was against Minnesota. And that sort of backs up what Lincoln Riley had to say after that game, where he felt like the offensive line played well enough to win. They put a lot of good stuff on tape. I don't foresee any changes coming unless there's an injury. I don't think we're going to see any performance-based changes like we did against Michigan. It seems like USC's found their five, and they're going to go with it now. If there's a first half like there was against Michigan and Elijah Page, for whatever reason, just has a total clunker, then there probably will have to be a performance-based change, but I really believe that they want to roll with that five. So all the fans who are saying, oh, we got to switch this guy, we got to switch that guy, I wouldn't expect to see any changes, at least from the jump for USC. And if there is a change, things are probably going pretty bad, so you better hope there isn't one.
Yeah, USC's allowed the second most pressures of any Power 4 team. The problem is on the other side, Penn State, I believe, is number one in total number of pressures, and when they get their pressures, they're the second quickest team in time to pressure. So they get to you often, and they get to you very quickly, and that probably presents a lot of problems for USC's offensive line this week.
Well, we'll be watching the offensive tackles, of course, because in some of these defeats that USC's had, you can point to some big mistakes from those players, and they just have to get better. And Lincoln Riley said on Tuesday, these guys with more experience, they will get better, so that's what he thinks, and we'll go from there. Two other observations you pointed out, Jack. Greedy Vance had an interception during some scout team work with the scout team offense going up against the first team defense. And then Benny Wiley, the strength coach, was doing some work with the defensive linemen, and he was working with a couple of the walk-ons after he was working with the full group, guys who were trying to rehab, get back into shape. We don't see Wiley work too much with some of these guys on the field from when we're able to watch practice, so I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, Greedy Vance continues to impress us in coverage, too. The play before he had a pick, he had a pass breakup, and I think if you're looking at the USC defensive backs, he's easily been the best one in coverage so far this year. And as D'Anton Smith mentioned, as a former nickelback, when you're at nickel, you have a lot more space to cover, and that means the receiver has more space to play with, and I think Greedy Vance has still been really, really good. DeCarlos Nicholson also had a pick in that period, and he has stepped up above John Humphrey in the cornerback room. He would right now be the third cornerback, but if Jacoby Covington, who got banged up at the end of the game against Minnesota, if he's unable to go or if he's limited, that might thrust DeCarlos Nicholson into a potential starting job. So it was good to see him make a big play in practice as well.
And we were wondering, John Humphrey doesn't play at all in the most recent USC game, the Minnesota defeat. Is he a redshirt candidate? He already redshirted at UCLA. This is his final year of eligibility, so he's played 4 games. He didn't play in a fifth against Minnesota. His back is against the wall a little bit right now because he's just running out of time. So I'm interested to see how he responds to not playing, and if there is an injury to Covington and he's not able to play against Penn State, then of course he goes up on the depth chart. But I know Humphrey, he had very high expectations for coming here, and he is going to push, and he was the first guy to practice on Tuesday. That'll be something to watch. If he starts to play more, look for him to play with an edge because he's running out of time.
Yeah, that was to kind of get into what we talked about with D'Anton Lynn. That was the one thing that I asked Lynn, because last year they were both together at UCLA, and Humphrey started 11 of the 12 games for the Bruins. So to see a game where he comes to USC, a defense that was worse last year, and he doesn't get any snaps in a given game, I was a little surprised. And D'Anton Lynn, like he did for a couple other players, he doesn't get into the specifics. He said, just continue to work hard, keep playing well in practice. He said the same thing about Elijah Hughes, a guy who that I think has only taken snaps in one game for USC this season. He said that about a couple other guys as well. So he doesn't want to get into the specifics of why guys haven't built the roles that maybe fans expected them to. But the John Humphrey one is the one that's really stood out to me, as you would have penciled him in, maybe even written it in Penn, that coming after as he was a transfer, he's going to be a starter. But then Jalen Smith and Jacoby Covington start to play really well. So you're like, okay, John Humphrey, he's that swing guy. He'll be the third. He's better than DeCarlos Nicholson. He's playing a lot more than DeCarlos Nicholson. And all of a sudden, Nicholson is the one that has overtaken him. And it was weird to see a game where we don't see a single snap from Humphrey.
It's all about the competition, and some guys will rise up, some guys will go down the depth chart. at least in Humphrey's case, he's played a lot, and I could certainly see him factoring back in, even if there isn't an injury in the future, because he is a pretty talented guy. So, yeah, something to watch there. I asked Lynn, what's it like to call the defense when players like Sam Green and Jade Abasiri have to play, because just the depth with USC right now is taking a hit with some of the injuries. And at first he talked about how you have to be comfortable with your personnel and you have to call plays that you know they'll be able to execute. And that stood out to me because USC, in that Minnesota game, they were relying on guys. Anthony Lucas goes out. Sam Green comes in for, I think, 6 snaps. Basiri's in at the end of the game. On that final goal line stand, both those guys were playing, and there's really only one play call in that instance. But that stood out to me because if someone gets hurt going forward, we know Bear Alexander's gone. We know Eric Gentry's probably gone. If there's a linebacker injury, there's going to be most likely either Anthony Beavers or a younger player going in there. And if someone gets hurt in the middle of the defense of interior, then there's going to be another young player there. So a lot of these guys are getting up to speed really quick, and we saw it didn't really work out too well for USC at the end of that Minnesota game. If they have to play some of those guys against Penn State, I expect them to be more prepared this week because they know that they may be relying on some of those guys, whereas against Minnesota, maybe they were kind of not expecting that with some of the injuries that played out in that game.
Yeah, it was interesting. It almost felt like Lynn gave 2 different answers to the same question during the press conference, where at first he said, well, I don't really pay attention to who's in there. I don't really care about that when making a play call. You kind of just have to go with what you would call the defense normally and assume that they know it and say, they're supposed to be prepared for this. They're a member of the defense. You have to treat them with kind of the same mentality as anyone else that's in there. Then later in the press conference, he said, well, you really just got to be aware of who you have on the field and what they're capable of and, what they know versus others. And so it did feel like he kind of gave 2 different answers to the same question, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, a little bit. Another takeaway I had, that I'm sure he's a big part of the rotations in practice, but in the game, the assistant coaches determine the rotation. So when we see Bryson Shaw, when we see some of Zion Branch, I'm sure that's the plan going in. But if something needs to change, it's not like the assistant coaches, based on what Lynn said today, are going up to him and talking about, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? It's more Lynn is just so focused on the play calls. The assistant coaches determine who gets on the field. And I don't know if Cam Fountain traveled. I probably should know if I'm talking about him on instant analysis. But seeing Sam Green play at defensive end, I wonder what he did if Fountain was available to elevate over a guy like Cam Fountain, and that's a Sean Nua decision, it sounded like, because that is in the game, and that's not something that they game plan for. So that was another takeaway I had. They've talked about that a little bit, how the assistant coaches determine who goes in and who goes out, and Lynn just calls the plays. But hearing him talk about how he needs to know who's on the field to determine what plays to call, it's not easy coaching when you have the play clock and everything's so fast. So that was kind of a nice behind-the-curtain look a little bit, and that stood out to me too.
Tackling was a big conversation today. Trojans missed 13, which is a season high, and Lincoln Riley had mentioned, I believe it was on Trojans Live, we missed tackles in that game that we just weren't missing earlier on in the season. What was some of your biggest takeaways about the tackling conversation, specifically from D'Anton Lynn?
Well, people will be mad, but it reminded me of last year, because what do you say? It's effort. No one is saying we're out of position. No one's saying we didn't do a good enough job. It's just one of those things. You just need to do a better job of it. There's no magic fix, and that's what Lynn sort of talked about. He said just because you tackle well one game doesn't mean you're a good tackling team, and just because you tackle poorly in another doesn't necessarily mean you're a bad tackling team. So I do think fundamentals has to do with it. Lincoln Riley's talked a lot about that, so I'm sure they got back to fundamentals a little bit this week. I don't think it was an effort thing at all. To me, I asked about fatigue in this game. I could see how some of those guys were a little bit tired with some of those limited depth options for USC. Again, no one's going to come out and say we were tired, as much as I'm trying to get him to say that, but those are some of the reasons that I think there were missed tackles. So let's see how USC responds, because last year it was sort of a snowball effect. They played well against the Nevadas and against some of those, the Stanford, some of those poor teams, but then second half against Colorado, it's missed tackle galore, and then it snowballs into worse and worse. I'm not saying that's going to happen this year, but let's pay attention to that, and let's see what this staff does to try to tackle better compared to the last staff, and if they do a better job, then the staff will be worth their money.
Yeah, I think it is worth noting, too, that it was more forced missed tackles by Darius Taylor, the running back, and that's what he said Mascarenas Arnold brought up. He said that their running backs were really good at breaking tackles. He basically put it into the words, they were running harder than we wanted to tackle them. And he said that at that point, they just need to be better at executing. They got out-executed by the good running backs. But it's not like last year where you might have seen some scrawny slot receiver shrug off a tackle from an edge guy that probably should have been made. This time it's like you got to give credit to Minnesota for the running backs breaking the tackles. Similarly to how we've seen Quentin Joyner run with the ball or Woody Marks run with the ball in that game, where it felt like how did he get out of that tackle? And it's less of a wow, the defense just a blatant missed tackle on that one. It's more, I think you give credit to the running backs too, and you're going to get that from every team. But I did think that was worth noting that's probably a little bit different than last year's team, where it's maybe it's an even higher number and not more than 13.
Yeah, and last year there were more missed tackles where it was like, how the heck did that happen?
Yeah.
So I get what you're saying. I thought Minnesota, their running backs were really patient too, and that contributed to it, where like if a running back had just hit the hole, there's probably a guy there, but they waited for plays to develop, and then that maybe got USC out of its comfort zone a little bit, and that just presented different challenges than they were used to. But yeah, shout out to Darius Taylor, who played really well in that game. Marcus Major had some nice runs. So USC in this new conference, we did so much talk about what would it look like in the Big Ten, what are teams going to do. We've seen a lot of teams in the secondary defensively play really far away, and then on offense it's been a lot of running the ball. I mean, especially Michigan, but Minnesota prides itself on running the ball. Penn State prides itself on running the ball, and that's why I hate to bring it up, but like the Bear Alexander loss and Eric Gentry being out, those are two of your best run defenders. This run game, like you play Rutgers, you play Nebraska, it's not going anywhere, so they'll need to figure out how to correct that sooner than later, of course, and it seems like they're trying to, but I'm just wondering about that depth with guys playing so many snaps, how that all looks.
Yeah, to kind of wrap it up, too, one of the other big talking points of the day was this Penn State offense, the challenges that it provides, whether it's Drew Aller at quarterback, the new system under Andy Kotelnicki, or the big offensive line and the physical running backs and the different multiple things they do with the tight ends and different quarterbacks in the run game. What stood out to you most maybe about the conversation surrounding all the things the Penn State offense can do?
I asked Lynn about that quarterback who they bring in around the goal line. I forget his name, but they usually sit Aller if they have it at the 2 or the 1. And Lynn used the word gimmicky, which I thought was funny because it is kind of gimmicky. Like you have this guy who's probably not going to throw the ball. No one in the whole stadium at Penn State when he comes in against UCLA thinks he's going to throw it, and then he just runs it down your throat. So they can do some sort of different things out of that. And he talked about, Lynn did, how that tightens the call sheet a little bit because you sort of know what's coming, even if it's hard to stop. And I asked him if that presents a challenge when they do bring in a new quarterback, and he kind of poo-pooed it, said not really. So that made sense to me. But yeah, it's a tough offense, Jack, where Aller, sometimes he does miss some throws, but he can certainly make you pay. He does throw a nice deep ball. I've watched him a lot, and just when he misses, it's ugly, but he does have some good plays in him for sure. He was a really highly ranked recruit, and we're seeing that. Their offensive line is good. The running back's good. Penn State, they don't have like an explosive offense. That's not the way I would describe it, but they're solid. And that new offensive coordinator, if you watch that UCLA game, putting that guard in motion, and then he hammers the defensive end for UCLA. I don't want to say it's vanilla because that's wrong, but like they have kind of a vanilla offense, but they do it in a different way. I don't know if that totally makes sense. It's not a ton of like razzle-dazzle crazy stuff until they get to the goal line, but you do see like an offensive lineman go in motion sometimes, and they're good at getting the ball down the field chunk by chunk by chunk.
Yeah, that's something that Lynn mentioned as well, is that they might come at you with different looks, but in reality it's simple. They're trying to do this thing, they're just going to try and disguise it. And that's what makes the Lincoln Riley offense so good, actually. Like the Trojans don't actually have a ton of plays in the Lincoln Riley offense. It's just formations, and they do things in different ways, and they'll do things with guys standing in different spots, and it's almost the opposite for Penn State. Like they're doing all of these little things, but they're trying to do the same thing every time. And so I'm interested to see if USC will be able to stop that. There's no question that the Trojan defense has improved. I think the past game is where you're really seeing it because they've got the talent there. I'm not sure yet if the bodies are completely right on the defensive line, and they are still learning to fully tackle. The one criticism I think that you could say for USC's defense this year is that even when they've gone up against teams where they know what they're going to do, they haven't been able to stop it when it's in the run game. I think they'd be able to stop a team. We know you're going to pass, and we're going to stop you, like they did against Wisconsin in the second half. For a couple different weeks now, USC has known that the other team wants to run the ball, and they haven't been able to stop the run completely. Not take it away. Like you're still giving up a couple hundred yards on the ground when you know it's going to be coming every play. I think that's one area where you want to see USC improve. I'm interested to see, because Penn State can do more than these other teams that we've seen offensively, whether that's a Wisconsin or a Minnesota, because they've got Drew Aller, they've got two great running backs, but they've got a good tight end and different wide receivers. I wonder if they will get away from just completely committing to the run game. Will they be able to stay patient and do what a team like Minnesota or Michigan has done to USC, because that's their only option? Will Penn State be able to just put the other options aside, say, we could do these things, but we don't need to. I feel like that's something that USC fans have seen with Lincoln Riley, that he's been unable to do that in the past. So I almost wonder if USC facing an offense that can do more is maybe a benefit, because Penn State might talk itself out of just completely committing to the run every play.
That's a good question. I want to know what it looks like in the fourth quarter, and I've talked about fatigue on instant analysis, and I haven't really backed up why I felt like USC was tired. Gavin Meyer in that Minnesota game, he played the most defensive snaps that he has since 2022. Like, he didn't play as many defensive snaps this year or last year at Wyoming, so he's just out there for a lot of the time. And then Nate Clifton only plays 8 of the final 32 defensive snaps. Was he a little bit tired at the end of that game? I have some questions there. When they don't have Eric Gentry and Bear Alexander, two really important pieces, like, that is going to affect you, especially when you're in the Big Ten, a league where there are a lot of teams on your schedule that are going to ground and pound and just take it to you. So I do think we sort of saw the effects of some fatigue against Minnesota, and here against Penn State, if they do stick to the run, you're right, who knows what they're going to do. Could they try to throw it more than we anticipate? That's absolutely a possibility. But in the fourth quarter, when USC's relied on a lot of these guys in the middle for so many snaps, is Penn State fresher? Does USC have another gear that we didn't see against Minnesota? That, to me, is a big talking point heading into this one as well.
I think, too, the points where you look at USC tackling worse, maybe being a more fatigued defense, the offense has given them no help at the end of their 2 losses.
Exactly.
Both of those games against Michigan and Minnesota, they had 3 and outs that led to the other team's game-winning drives. So the defense had battled. Against Michigan, they had gotten a stop. Against Minnesota, they had allowed that touchdown at the goal line with a semi-short field for Minnesota. Offense goes out 3 and out both times, so the defense has to go back out there. If you want your defense to not be fatigued, you have to move the football. I also wonder, and I hate to be the person that brings it up, is travel a factor in that as well? We have seen that Big Ten teams are 1-7 when traveling 2 or more time zones. This year, Penn State has to do that this weekend. So is it maybe Penn State that in the fourth quarter looks a little bit fatigued? I think this weekend kind of it can, with a Penn State win and an Ohio State win, make you throw out the travel factor. But if both of those teams lose, or maybe one of those 2 teams just doesn't look the same, then maybe we do have to be thinking about that as something that is going to be a new factor in the conference. Coaches aren't going to use it as an excuse. I personally think football is football. But if we continue to see the trend keep up, that's something to keep in mind.
I totally agree. If Ohio State loses to Oregon, even though Oregon's really good, Ohio State is favored. Penn State is favored here against USC. Like, I'm with you, Jack. That would tell me a lot, because on paper you'd probably expect both those teams who are traveling to win, but that's why they play the game, as they say. And if that record stays at 1 and with 1 win, and it goes to 1-10 or 1-11, however many 2+ time zone games there are, I absolutely think it's going to be a factor. Whereas so far, could it just be kind of a fluky thing? Maybe. But if Penn State goes down, if Ohio State goes down, then I'm with you. We have to talk about that.
I think the best defense for USC this week is finding the offense again, an offense that's averaging under 30 points per game. Lincoln Riley in his career as an offensive mind has only had an offense average under 40 points per game once in his career. So this is a big step down from what he's used to. But they've been better in the Coliseum in his Trojan career. Will that help them out? I think if they go out and they put up points like they've shown they've been able to do the last 2 years, and maybe it hasn't happened against the marquee teams, but last year against Washington, they scored up and down the field almost at will against Washington. The defense was just so bad that it didn't even matter. If you can bring a performance like that to the Coliseum this weekend, I think that helps out the defense a ton, and we'll see if USC can do it. Kind of feels like the offense needs to get back to that 2022 early mid to mid part of 2023 form for the Trojans to be able to pull off the upset win. But that's all we've got for Instant Analysis today. We will have a full in-depth podcast tomorrow, Tunnel Vision live at night, previewing the game, and then we'll get to the game on Saturday, one of the more anticipated games, not only of the season, but of recent years for USC, as the Trojans look to beat a top 5 team for the first time since they beat the same program, Penn State, in the 2016 Rose Bowl. But for Connor Morrissette, I'm Jack Smith. Thanks for watching Instant Analysis. Make sure you're checking out USCfootball.com for more.